Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jason Larson, and I'm the head of content here at the International Institute for Analytics, and I'm your host for today's session. And welcome to today's webinar, Inside a Federated Analytics Transformation. In case you're new to the International Institute for Analytics, or IIA, as we typically call ourselves, we are an independent, strategic, outcome-focused data and analytics advisory firm. We're practitioners working with practitioners. Analytics is all we do, and we do it with a relentless focus on measurable impact. Visit our homepage for more information about who we are and how we support data and analytics leaders in making the difficult and necessary transition to advanced analytics and AI. All right, before we dive into the presentation, let's go over a couple of housekeeping items. First, we encourage you to submit questions or comments through the chat window, and we'll make sure to save time at the end of the session to address as many questions as possible. The dialogue and questions that you bring to the table adds a lot of value to these sessions, so don't be shy. Converse as a group in the comments, share resources, send us your questions. That level of engagement gives us all more to take away from the session. A recorded version of this webinar will be available and emailed out after the presentation. All right, without further ado, we are delighted to welcome Keith Moody and Jack Phillips as our featured speakers today. Keith is the Assistant Vice President of Analytics at Discount Tire, and Jack is the CEO of IIA, and they're going to discuss Discount Tire's transition to a federated analytics operating model. IIA has had the privilege of partnering with Keith and his team at Discount Tire for over 5 years. Throughout this time, we've supported both practitioners and senior leaders, connecting them with IIA's esteemed network of experts to guide their advanced analytics journey across a wide range of initiatives and complex challenges. Over the course of our collaboration, we've worked alongside 9 analytics leaders at Discount Tire, witnessing their evolution as they drove impact across 79 projects and initiatives. That's amazing, including their journey toward federated analytics. If you're new to IIA and you lead a data and analytics team or have strategic responsibilities within that team, scan the QR code on the screen to schedule a free 30-minute consultation with an IIA expert to talk through your specific organizing and operating challenges within the context of your company. Please take advantage of the opportunity. I promise you'll walk away with fresh insights. Also, to help guide your efforts in transitioning to or resetting your federated analytics operating model, we put together a comprehensive executive guide based on years of experience advising clients on this challenge. The resource lays out, among other things, key considerations, transition strategies, and common pitfalls when adopting a federated model. Follow the link in chat to download the ebook, and we hope you find it is useful. Okay. All right. So the ebook actually touches on key themes that Mark Demarest, one of IIA's top experts and authorities on federated analytics, explored in last month's webinar. To recap that conversation and tee up Keith and Jack, IIA believes that federated analytics is really the most appropriate end state for mature or maturing analytics organizations operating at enterprise scale. When analytics programs fail to deliver material business value consistently, it usually comes down to one or both of 2 core issues in our experience. First, analytics programs and projects are not funded or measured properly. And the second is analytics operating, is that the analytics operating model within the organization is not tuned for the organization's culture, history, and needs or ways of working. Like I said, we've been at this for a long time, over a dozen years, and what we see time and again is analytics programs at large, complex companies get stuck in what we call the oscillation trap, where they swing between centralized and decentralized org structures and operating systems, and this oscillation can go on for years. Ultimately, how you organize your analytics team rests on a continuum of design choices. And it's very common for a maturing analytics program to experience some push and pull toward the gravitational force of a hybrid model, if you will. So to establish just a bit of definitional clarity for today's discussion, when we're talking about centralized models, which is on one end of the spectrum, we're talking about a single core analytics group, often spun out of IT, that gathers requirements, produces deliverables, and manages analytical applications throughout their life cycles. So, in the context of analytics demand and supply, as demand grows, response time typically slows in centralized models. Intake and prioritization models typically kick in, and some groups are kept waiting too long and others get nothing. Eventually, demand side teams build shadow capabilities, it's very common, or turn to outside vendors because centralized supply can't keep pace with demand. So on the other side of the spectrum, we have distributed or decentralized models. In a distributed analytics environment, you have embedded local analytics teams, often funded by their business units, and these embedded teams typically emerge in response to a troubled or absent centralized model. Local analytics teams meet local needs at local speed, and that's their core advantage. But local capabilities vary in distributed models typically. Teams are unevenly resourced and inconsistent in quality. That is a common theme that we see for distributed models. As demand fragments and technologies multiply, costs typically rise, and the burden on shared systems increases. So again, the sweet spot in our view is a federated analytics model where you have a central team and multiple local teams working in concert, balancing scale and speed. In a federated model, the central team owns shared platforms, governance, advanced analytics, and AI, and it flexes based on local team maturity. In a federated model, local teams deliver at business speed, funded by and aligned to their units, with autonomy sometimes over final form data and information products. And in a federated model, a shared community of practice connects it all, sustained by the center to promote consistency without control. So in this transition to a federated model from the perspective of Keith, an analytics leader, heading up this new way of working is really our subject for today. So at this point, I think it's appropriate to probably turn it over to Jack and Keith to kind of dive in. I very much look forward to the discussion. I hope that context kind of helps everybody. And I'll let you two take it from here.
Jason, thanks. Good morning to everybody. Midday, good day to everybody on the phone. I'm really excited to have Keith with us today. Keith, you've been a longstanding friend of IAA's, 15 years or so at Bridgestone, just under 5 now at Discount Tire. You and I have talked over the years a lot about the pluses and the minuses. I'll call it the mechanics, the theoretical of what Jason introduced, right? We've sort of got that continuum. And over the last, I don't know, 3, 4 months here, we've had a discrete focus in this federated model because everybody seems to believe that is nirvana, as Jason said, the finishing point, right? And today, you've seen all of these models. You've just relatively recently implemented a Discount Tire, the Federated. So excited to have a conversation today about that. But I feel like before we jump into it, is this continuum still right to you? Is this the right way to think about the options that enterprises have at different times in their analytics lives? Is this still relevant? So still, I guess, appropriate?
Yeah, absolutely. This resembles my career path and what I've been through on my journey of building different analytics organizations. And I really think that that continuum, it really does start with a centralized, and then based on the organization's maturity, business needs, kind of evolves from there, sometimes stopping in COE for a little bit, sometimes bouncing back and forth between centralized and decentralized, but completely agree. And definitely support that. Federated is really the ultimate end state of where organizations and the maturity needs to get to help support the enterprise and organization appropriately.
Yeah. And Jason mentioned Mark Demarest here on the IAA team, this idea of oscillation.
Hmm.
Um, we do see firms uh, who fairly frequently switch across this continuum, right?
Hmm.
And at some point, I'd love to get your view on the fatigue that causes, right? Because hey, we think we need to be more decentralized. The demand side isn't getting their needs met the way they should. Or gosh, now we have this proliferation. Let's go back to centralized. You know, and again, we talk about corporate culture. some of this is very much based on how decisions are made inside of an organization. But talk about that in your experience. This is pretty common.
Yeah, absolutely. The tension between the two definitely bounces back and forth. And I think that's really the opportunity for organizations to kind of stop and look at, all right, you can keep bouncing back and forth, and there's always the pull on either side, but it's making deliberate decisions about that analytics operating model and your path to get there. In my prior life, helping build out Bridgestone America's analytics operating model, I truly started centralized organizations, kind of built it up by individual businesses, started credit card and then retail and then kind of manufacturing. But ultimately, we moved to a COE type of model as an interim step, knowing that that wasn't the right landing spot, but it gave us a opportunity to start thinking about how do we develop some standards? How do we start to socialize those within the organization? And ultimately provided some time to figure out what does that federated operating model need to look like and how to structure that properly.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. All right. Well, okay. So turn to discounts.
Mhm.
And the this is something you've been doing for, I mean, you sort of were able to pull this off. Give us a sense of timing. You've been there just under 5 years.
Yep, just under 5 years. We really started as a centralized operating model, and essentially the exact same situation that you've talked about earlier was, hey, as a centralized team, we've got governance in place. And the reality is, with that centralized governance, we're working on the highest priority things of the enterprise. At the same time, what is naturally happening is the reality of, well, we can't support all the business units and all the demand and needs. So it starts to create the swell of the decentralized model and the need for other organizations, segments to start developing some of their own capabilities to take care of their own needs. Well, now that creates all right, now that we've started to create that swell of demand within the business segments. Now it becomes all right, let's formally talk about it. Let's formally figure out how we transition from this very centralized operating model to a federated model. What does that look like? How do we evolve from here?
Yeah. And the impetus, that, in other words, you've done this a few times. Were there certain signals you were looking for? I mean, I'm assuming that largely the demand side of the equation, in other words, your business side partners, as they grew in appreciation and understanding for the value of what you and your team could do for them.
Yeah.
Was that kind of the driver? What was what are the signals that other firms, other leaders should be looking for as a time to transition from kind of a command and control? Let's at least just set some standards to
Yeah.
getting more flexible.
Yeah, I think, starting with the centralized model, it really goes to how are you as a centralized model demonstrating the value of analytics to an organization? How are you taking those projects in? How are you delivering tangible results back to the business? That ultimately gets other leaders interested into it. The moment they start seeing it, then you'll start seeing leaders trying to come to a centralized organization and get some of their needs satisfied. When some of that doesn't happen that way with that mechanism, they then recognize the need for themselves to make those investments. And the recognition right there, and the moment you start seeing teams formalize and form across different segments, that's the moment that you see, okay, leadership has already kind of bought into the concept of it, and they're starting to make their own investments. Now it's a question of does leadership recognize what happens if you continue on with this model of decentralized and investing on your own without a centralized mechanism, without standards, without even job role definitions, and how that could create problems for an organization. So it becomes that moment when leaders have decided themselves to make those investments in analytics. Now it's a question of helping the leaders to understand what are the implications of continuing to invest in that mechanism in that way, or to do something different.
Yeah. Yeah. And, a few folks have said this idea of local optimization. In other words, if you allow optimization at a local level but with blinders on, you talked about standards, you talked about job roles, but obviously you do end up eventually with a lot of perhaps duplicate purchases, duplicate hardware, software, duplicate data sets, a lot of duplicate effort.
Yeah.
Agreed?
Oh yeah, no, that's part of the as you start to see that, the earlier you can catch this and the earlier you can have these conversations with leadership in the journey, because it's absolutely the case. If you don't catch it early enough and have these conversations and have a deliberate approach to your operating model early, you then become the situation where you've got all this investment everywhere. You've got different standards. You've got, something as simple as, hey, we have a certified sales table. Well, now you may have 4 or 5 different certified sales tables, teams running different analysis and coming to different answers. And then leadership starts becoming well, wait, this number says one thing. Why does this number say another? And how are we going to make a decision as a company? So hopefully you can catch it early enough to make deliberate decisions before you get into that. It's a lot harder when you're in that type of organization setup to unwind and standardize and figure out how to move, if you can catch it earlier and help deliberately make those decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. Good question coming in from Sophia, which I'll come to, which actually asks about as much multiple geographies, so international teams. But it strikes me as as folks, as teams that are just starting out, you almost have to predict and expect that the conditions you've just described will come.
Mhm.
I periodically talk to leaders who wonder if they're into a new organization and the idea of, I'll keep it simple, data-driven decisioning, is part of their mantra, their charge. But they're wondering if, in fact, the business will catch on, right?
Mhm.
That there is no doubt in my mind that if you put it out there, they will come. In other words, if you build it, they will come. And so it's almost, I guess maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but you have to from the beginning expect that the demand side of the equation will want more and more and more, that you will eventually need to get to a federated, in other words, this will happen.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to expect it, and you also have to help influence it to make sure that these organizations, as they're evolving, are delivering those tangible results, and the results are broadcast and visible, especially in multiple organization, multiple country. That's where it's even more important to help get the word out about analytics and the success that's being delivered by a team, by an organization from an analysis and helping others understand that to try to help them see that the opportunity is there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've done a lot of work on just on the kind of the behaviors and the characteristics of leaders like you, and how your role changes when the demand side really perks up, and
Mhm.
all of a sudden you're almost, I'll use the word ombudsman. You're very much, from a role and time perspective, outward facing, whereas in this centralized stage you're probably much more inward facing. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes. And when you're centralized, you're very much about just managing your demand and only working on this. Whereas that's where it's so important to go, okay, even though I am centralized and I'm creating success, how is that success being broadcast out? Because that ultimately helps drive the adoption, the desire from the other leaders to make their own investments. And ultimately, you kind of do know that the organizations will eventually mature to it. The demand will come. People will see it. It's your role to help push that organization, help the understanding of the value that analytics is going to bring and how that's going to help support the business strategy and objectives.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, I know it's still early, and
Mhm.
you're in a transition, but what were the first, I don't know, two, three, four sort of actions that you took at the outset here, discrete actions you took to get this transition, this process moving?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first actions to really help with in discount tire to help move the organization in this direction were some of the local decisions that we could make probably about a year and a half ago, and making deliberate decisions towards a federated operating model. We have a centralized data science team, and about a year and a half ago, we had a project that had data science need, not only for that project, but we knew the project was going to be successful. We knew there was going to be value add. We knew that that would eventually transition to, okay, I need data science to continue to maintain that value and continue to generate more refinement on that. And we had multiple conversations with that segment about the funding mechanism. Was that going to be they were going to provide dollars to get that head count? Were we going to provide dollars? Ultimately, what we decided to do is basically take our centralized data science team and start to step towards that federated model with dedicating data scientists out to that segment and fully dedicating them, helping the segment understand what that means and how the governance, how the operating model actually works, with them being able to determine what is the highest priority needs for that data scientist. So it's been kind of a process and evolution, but that was one of the deliberate decisions that we made towards this model recently.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's really almost the contract, the basis of an agreement between you and the units. This
Mhm.
Aaron Hunt asks a good question here. What are some examples of, he uses the word commitments in the federated arrangement. I might call it almost a contract because, as I've talked to leaders, it really ends up being that, okay, funding,
Yeah,
that's important, right?
yeah,
If I'm gonna, and this then gets you to almost your business model,
yeah.
right? If you think about the logical extreme. So, yeah, comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. The commitments and agreements, that's the formulation of really the operating model itself. And the agreements, typically when I start to go this route, we really engage with the business units and talk about, well, what does it mean? Who's going to be in charge of governance? How does governance actually work? Who gets to, it's really about, well, keeping it dedicated to resources dedicated to that individual segment or business unit or company, and helping them understand, hey, that means you get to dictate what the priorities are of these resources. Nobody else. We're making sure that the standards are in place. Okay, let's talk through a scenario and a commitment that we're looking for of how do, great, I have this team that's there for my business needs for that segment. Okay, what's funding look like when this team has a need that's above their capacity? How is that going to work? Is that segment expected to contribute dollars? Are those dollars going to come out of the central organization? Like what combination thereof? And having those agreements and commitments, that's part of the development of that operating model, and standardizing so that way you can say, this is how this is going to work. And when these situations occur, this is how we've agreed to handle those things and commit to each other on this is the way we're going to handle this. Now, it doesn't mean that that's like that forever. You can always have a initial agreement, and the moment something happens, you have to work with leadership to figure out how best to satisfy the business need or demand.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes perfect sense. So it's almost a startup venture. It's almost like an entrepreneurial startup venture where you're getting your first whatever batch of clients, right? You're
Mhm.
negotiating with each one on SLAs, almost sort of delivery terms and financial terms. Aaron asks also an interesting question about, are there penalties or consequences for, he uses the word non-compliance. I'll assume that may mean non-participation. It's a great question, right? Because I've always assumed that at some point every business leader, once they understand, gosh, we could put, more money in our pockets by using data and analytics and AI better, everybody's in. But
Yeah.
if there are holdouts, what do you do? Do you just ignore them? How do you work? What do you do?
Yeah, I think it's I think the penalty system is just not a collaborative way to go about things.
Right.
Quite frankly, I think, working with that leader in those situations to talk through, and it's deliberate decisions that you'd make while you're developing the operating model. The difference between a solid line and a dotted line, the moment you start to create your blueprint, really dictates a huge amount on how easy or how hard it is going to be to try to enforce standards and make sure. It's not necessarily a punitive thing, but at the same time, it is a coaching, leadership opportunity and development opportunity the moment you start to see those things. And I always take it as a coaching moment more than all right, there's been a penalty situation. I need to penalize somebody. It's somebody's doing something because they're trying to satisfy a business need, because they're trying to do something. They may not understand the implications for the business. Their leadership may not understand the implications of what's being done there. And I just look at those as coaching moments to have those conversations with leaders, talk through those situations, and kind of work through how we can go about doing something differently in a different direction.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Before we move on, let me just pick up Sophia's question here, which I'm going to interpret as a really early stage question, a department that's just starting to formulate its data strategy, right? So it doesn't, I'm going to interpret that as not even really thinking about what do we do with the data, but just getting the plumbing in place, perhaps,
Mhm.
right? And let's add on, we're working in multiple countries.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's the case at Discount, but I would imagine at Bridgestone,
Yeah.
it probably was, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Not the case at Discount, but definitely that case within Bridgestone. I think I've definitely been there, and I think the challenge um, is not necessarily focusing on the data itself. Focus on the business need and aligning your analytic strategy and your data strategy to what is the business need. That helps anchor everything into business value. Because if you're ultimately aligned to the business strategy and deliverables and you're helping support that, yes, from a data strategy, you may want to look at it broader or differently. However, the moment you're aligned to the strategy and the execution of the business and you're focusing your data strategy in support of that business objective, everything comes together. And it is truly, working across North and South America and my prior role, every organization, no matter where you are, has their own business strategy, has their business objectives, and how you can craft and create your own strategy in support of that and align those two things. It makes the operation execution of it so much easier.
yeah, yeah. Um, so yeah, I'm just couple of good questions here. In the old Mike Tyson adage, you start with a blueprint and then you get in the ring and you know what happens. Reflections on using that metaphor. It sounds like, I mean, you've done this before. You probably had a plan and you had a playbook almost.
Hmm. Yep.
Early versions of until you get hit in the jaw.
Oh yeah, 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 absolutely. Having that blueprint, I think, is the most important thing to go in that conversation. But to your point there, it's a conversation. It's a back and forth, and it's going to be a push and a pull conversation to really help, make everybody understand the consequences of some of those decisions.
Yeah.
But it is absolutely a heated conversation sometimes with some leaders about what are the implications, because the leaders are ultimately trying to deliver their value and they have their perceptions, and trying to see and meet those leaders where they are and help understand like the implications of how to achieve that in a different way and what does that mean for them. I think it's definitely a bit of a back and forth, and you have to be open and considerate of that leader, their perspective, and even sometimes it comes to conversations of timing. Great. I think that's a good spot to eventually land. We're not ready there yet. Okay, where are you at right now? How can I help you along this journey to ultimately get there? Work through that timing and the implications of it. Don't necessarily go, all right, this is the end state and we need to be there tomorrow. Be open and receptive to, great, we can create the roadmap for this thing 3 years out. How do we step your organization, the capabilities to get to that end state? Let's agree on the end state, but let's also agree on the steps to get there and what does that look like?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think our guidance historically has been you you can spend a lot of time on the playbook,
Hmm.
right? You can spend a lot of time on that. And there's probably a Goldilocks middle ground where, the bottom the last 10 assumptions you won't know until you actually,
Yep.
right, interface. And I think that then that brings us then to culture. and the unique culture of every enterprise. I think it's easy to, we're in the business of frameworks. We're in the business of the mechanics that should, in concept, work to some extent in every org. And yet, we're reminded every day of how brittle cultures, long-standing cultural norms can really be the ones that can get in the way of a great data and analytics and AI, if you will, program and initiative. And so talk to us a little, maybe reflecting on Bridgestone and on Discount, but what were some of those, you knew the culture, the corporate culture, but how has that how has that kind of either led to success or not?
Yeah, absolutely. No, understanding the cultural aspects and it's our role as leaders to influence. And I think that's one of the most important things is understanding the culture in which you're operating and how best to navigate that. I was with Bridgestone for 15 years and built that capability up. So I really was intimate with that particular culture and I understood leadership, very connected with that leadership and what they were trying to achieve and how to work with them. So that helped me navigate and working with them and getting their partnership to help navigate the organization to ultimately land on a federated operating model. I will say, I'm 5 years into Discount Tire, but I'm still considered brand new.
Yeah.
There's many people, my boss has been with the organization for over 30 years. So she has an incredible amount of cultural knowledge. And honestly, it's that partnership between within our segment and with her and my peers really is helping us shape how we proceed forward with an operating model to do it the right way for the culture and support of the culture. But it is definitely, you have to recognize that even if, all right, I do have a great end state, culturally, how to operate in there to influence, to help leaders come to that same conclusion. It just takes time and it really is a process. It is not you have one conversation, now the light is on and everybody's on board. It takes time.
It takes time, yeah. Yeah, I remember 10 years ago, Mark Schaefer, who continues to run a large part of the analytics organization at the Disney organization. I interviewed him on stage and he came forward with a fairly bold prediction. And he said, we're at the beginning of a data-driven, well, I'll call it culture, where, and I anticipate, Jack, that if we do this right, it will change the way we organize ourselves and the very culture of the company, right?
Mhm.
And so I talk to leaders and they are often saying, well, I may be limited by the culture. Mark opened and said, well, I think if we do this right, we will update, we will bring forward the culture, right? Thoughts on that?
Oh no, I completely agree. I think the culture where it is doesn't mean that that's where the culture is going to be forever. And
Yeah.
honestly, the partnership and understanding the business need, we quite frequently meet with segments where data is not their strength, but they have learned to partner with us and say, "Hey, this is what I'm wrestling with. This is the problem I'm trying to fix. I don't know. Please help me." And just right there, that allows to bring data and capability to those segments and those leaders and help them make data-based decisions that they may not have made before. But it's that partnership, that relationship, that culture that ultimately helps data come to the forefront for decision making and how to handle some of those problems and opportunities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, that's helpful. Another good question here from Troy Sayers, uh, which, which, I'll come back to this kind of local versus central question. Any guidance, insights, learnings on how to share data assets that have been created by federated teams with other federated teams across the organization? I mean, I think this sort of gets to uh, Jeff Goldman at Procter and Gamble is always fond of saying, "I'm really trying to incentivize and encourage local innovation,"
Mhm.
and yet obviously the downside of this model is sometimes Well, so then there's a reuse question. Let's make sure back to what I was describing earlier. So have you yet gotten to that point where, boy, what a great innovation in either a geography or at a business unit. Let's co-opt that and spread it. Or perhaps I'll say the opposite, or kill it because it's actually doing more harm to the broad, I don't know, I'll make it up, the broader data infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think and this is where the deliberate decisions throughout the process make an incredible impact on these situations, right? The moment you can start to standardize and say, look, certain data is going to be out of this central organization. We're going to certify it here. All right, what is your operating model for those teams? And when they start creating data, setting the boundaries on what data they are going to be able to create as certified, how they're going to go about that certification process.
Yeah.
And then ultimately, as an organization, how do we set up the technology and infrastructure to be able to, when one of those teams does create a great data asset that truly needs to be leveraged by others, how do we then use that technology to surface that and make it available to others?
Yeah. Yeah. So certification and verification. Yeah, that
Mhm.
makes sense. Um, Let me come back to, yeah, Eric's got a good question too. You know, Keith, just maybe we've known each other a long time. You've worked with IA a long time. Um, there are a lot of folks on the phone today who are maybe they haven't heard of IA before. They've been attracted by this particular topic. Uh, Talk a little bit about some of the work that you've gotten from us. The framework's been helpful. How does IIA help in this process?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've been working with Jack and IA for an extremely long amount of time. And I'd say, it's really helped in two different aspects for me. One, understanding the research and the frameworks help an immense amount. At the same time, the ability for me to stay on top of the industry and what's going on in the industry, that's a personal how I leverage IIA. At the same time, I also leverage IIA in a different way for my teams. I'm a leader who likes my leaders to go figure things out on their own and solve on their own. And even though I may have a perspective and I do have certain experience that leans in this direction based on what I've been through, I also want my leaders to go out, talk to other leaders, talk to other practitioners, get perspectives, understand what has worked, what hasn't worked, and how they come to it together. So that way it's a collaborative process. It's an upskilling of my leaders. So that way we can really have much better, deeper conversations about how to support the organization and what is right for the organization right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay. Well, yeah, and that, I mean, that does sort of define our vision. And I think, it's helpful, I think, for us certainly to hear that feedback. Um, because this is an early craft. This is still, in other words, even though we love to say in this AI world, hey guys, we've been doing this for what, 30, 40 years already, right? Right.
Mhm.
It does still feel new. It relates a little to Eric King's question here around, you know, who leads this operation? Well, obviously you do. But uh, he's sort of leading toward a question of how high do you have to be up in the organization to have enough influence? I don't know. Talk a little bit about that and maybe the evolution of this role.
Yeah, right now, I'm pretty high in the organization, but at the same time, it really doesn't matter. Because I will give you my story started with me being a data scientist in Bridgestone. I was the only data scientist in Bridgestone Americas. And I started by delivering a couple $1 million with a incremental project that nobody thought we could do anything. And then from there, the organization was so impressed with it. They're like, let's give Keith a whole bunch of people and see how he leads people. And at that point, I was a data scientist. I didn't know what leadership was. I'm going, why am I now responsible for people? And what I figured out is I actually love working with people and helping the organization develop. And ultimately, what happened was the CEO worked with me, and basically we started to create an organization, create a centralized team, and grow that team and capability turned what was a $30 million OP company to over 110 in over a couple years, which was unheard of for that company. Which then got more influence and more insight and, well, go build this capability and this capability. And I say that because the reality is within an organization, yes, if you have position, it does help, no question. And you do as a leader, you do need to figure out how are you going to go about influencing the organization, bottom up, top down. I will say top down is absolutely easier, more direct. And if you can do that directly from whatever position you're in, I was an analyst talking to the president of what was the credit card division at that time. And he really opened up. He understood where I was coming from and he saw what I could do for the organization and what analytics meant to the company. And he was the one that trusted me and empowered me to help influence that. So you don't necessarily have to have position. You can influence. It's just how you go about influencing and how you choose your strategy to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. Also in this question, who excels in this role? And as you know, we've done a lot of thinking. Just again, I refer to the behaviors point. It does seem as though to be successful, having time down with your hands dirty, if you will. Now, I mean, you started as an analyst, as a data scientist, and you've moved up. Uh, we also see increasingly horizontal leaders moving from, I'll make it up, and running supply chain. Uh, um, uh, can be effective, and so maybe there's some blend of that. But as you have moved up in your career, as you said, you enjoy managing people.
Mhm.
But you have needed to mature your skills in a way
Mhm.
that I assume your communication skills,
Yeah.
uh, just having comfort in getting out to business units, perhaps periodically the board and the CEO saying, "Hey, get up here and let us know what we're getting for all this investment." And
Yeah.
right, I mean, so you've had to really think about those set of skills for yourself, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a data scientist, it was all about the technical, right? You're deep into the coding methodologies and this and that to be able to solve those particular problems. But and what I really transitioned to was the leadership capabilities. And it's those capabilities that truly make you successful in working and partnering with the other leaders to help understand where they are, what they're trying to do, how to help them achieve what they're after. I think those skills, that's one of the reasons why in my organizations, I truly separate the technical track from the leadership track.
Yeah.
I know there are player coach organizations out there, and I know there are those types of roles out there. When in my experience, it's been much more beneficial, much more straightforward for the separation of those capabilities. Keep leadership focusing on leadership capabilities, relying on the technical expertise of those that chose the technical path, rather than trying to force them both. Because in my experience, I personally was equally bad at both
Yeah.
when I was trying to be hands-on keyboard and try to do leadership at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. And it strikes me, even if we return back to the federated model, and you know, that if you think about the skills that are needed as a leader in either central or fully decentralized, it's in those models, it's fairly easy to be one or the other. It strikes me that in the federated model, you really have to do both, right? You're keeping a balance back to, we call this the information economy, and that the supply and the demand are in balance, but you are, at 10 o'clock, you're outward facing, at 1 o'clock, you're inward facing, and back at 4, you're outward again, right? I mean, it seems like
Yeah.
you really have to do all those things.
Absolutely. Because of the federated model and how it's all structured between the different organization segments, the ability to pop in over here, make sure that that team's having what they need, helping resolve any issues or opportunities, and then moving over to the next one. It is really, really those leadership capabilities and how you apply them across to help make sure everybody's getting what they need out of the model and making sure if there is an opportunity or issue, those are being surfaced and resolved and worked through to make sure everybody's getting the business units that are subscribing to this are getting what they're expecting out of the model.
Yeah. Okay, folks, we have about 10 minutes left. I've got a couple more questions, but if you all have questions in the audience, get them into the chat so we can include them. Markers of success, Keith, markers of success. So you're in this. What are you looking for? Both I guess, both just both documented markers of success, but also perhaps just some qualitative markers that you say I'm making progress.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is for me, I always look at markers of success. I look at an operating model development as truly cultural as change management process.
Yeah.
So I really think about change management in terms of, okay, who are the key stakeholders? Who are the people that need to be involved in this process? And then ultimately I start to look at those players and go, okay, where are they? Are they knowledgeable? Are they aware? Do they understand what this could be? And then from an operating model perspective in Federation, are they supportive? Are they detracting? All right, where are they on that spectrum? And then ultimately, how can I influence that? And that's one of the markers that I look for within the op model process and how is the organization moving? All right. I started with that initial scorecard and that assessment of everybody. Then I revisit that scorecard and see, is the organization maturing? Are the teammates, the leaders, more aware? Are they getting on board with this? Am I making that type of progress? That's kind of markers within the operating model stand up itself. When you get into, all right, we've all agreed to this, and now we're going to be operating in this perspective. The markers really change at that point. Then it becomes okay, what's the value that we're delivering? What's the hard dollars? What's the soft dollars? What's the perception, right? Um, how are leaders perceiving the value? Are they seeing that we agreed to this operating model and I'm seeing the benefit? I'm seeing this happen for me in a way that I didn't have before.
Yeah. Um, one thing we've heard a lot, leaders will say, well, if depending on if you're a public company or a private company, are you seeing signals from either CEO or C-level folks? Are they, is it being mentioned? Is there a higher uptick in that in a couple of key vocabulary words? Is that you look at
Yeah.
that too?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely a consideration too, is we always kind of watch, we have um, quarterly type events here at Discount Tire, and we're always kind of watching what our CEO, um, what our chief corporate strategy officer, how many times is analytics being brought up, what's being mentioned, how are we being positioned? All those things are all key indicators also of like, okay, how is the organization receptive, maturing, grabbing onto and celebrating some of the wins and success?
Yeah. Um, really specific and good question here from John Jasper, just around, uh, I'm going to summarize it. Where do you put what sits up in the central entity, specifically, data science, database management, reporting, I'll call it some of the more tactical. How do you decide what actually does need to be controlled?
Yeah, absolutely. The process of it is that whole collaborative process within the leadership team to figure out what actually goes within the center versus within the individual segments. We're still in that process right now from a discount tire perspective, but I'll say from my prior experience, it's really thinking about governance first. For example, data science typically very limited number of resources. At the same time, there's very, very high demand. Okay, well, great if I centralize it, but then I've got this queue and then I've got this governance process over, and that really limits the expansion and the use of it for some of these other business units. I could completely centralize that, but if I do that, then I really limit the business and figuring out how to properly set that up. There may be some combination of, hey, I'm going to keep a centralized data science team, but for this segment, they have enough established need and they have enough desire and have enough potential. Hey, I'm going to give them a dedicated resource out and define the operating model in that way. When we look at it, we definitely see data science as one of those that it has to have the central connection because of the cost, because of the need, and also because there's a lot of misperception out there. Um, AI is thrown out as a buzzword to use in a bunch of different things, which gets a lot of hype. At the same time, it also creates situations where there may be a lot of spend and not necessarily a lot of good project definition. So the more that you can centralize and have that type of governance set up to make sure that the projects, even if the business is saying, hey, I want to work on this, by having a solid line, you get to have the hard conversation to go, great, what's a deliberate outcome? How are we going to measure this outcome? What does success look like before we start engaging in this type of project? So we typically think of data science, core data governance. We're talking about the centralized enterprise reporting and dashboarding across segments, one view for the entire organization. Those are typically the main things that within the center of the organization.
Yeah.
Then it becomes, all right, how do you do insights and value realization and things like that within the different setups.
Yeah, interesting. And maybe we finish here on Krishna's question because I think it relates, which is, and this is, yeah, how do you manage what he would characterize as if you will, projects with no immediate monetary value, right? So he uses the example of just say better reporting. How do you, as you go more to a central to a federated model, I use the idea of business model, pretty much, I mean, there is a financial exchange between
Yep.
you all and the business unit. And so how do you handle what Krishna would characterize as non-monetary requests or non-measurable perhaps requests?
Yeah, I think as long as there's value, it may not have a tangible dollars, but does that business unit see the value in it? For example, we know BI creates immense value. The business is run on BI every day.
Right.
Quantifying the exact dollar impact of BI is a wasted exercise.
Yeah.
At the same time, every leader in the company will go, well, yeah, I run my business off this. There's tons of
Right.
value in it.
Right.
So as long as the leadership is supporting that there's a recognition of value and there's that clear expectation set up front that you're not going to try to come back and measure what is the impact of this BI report that we created. Okay, if we all agree that there's value in this, it all agrees that this is a priority for the organization. Great. Let's also agree on we're not going to measure the exact dollar impact. What we're going to do is put some other measures in. Hey, if I create a great BI report and nobody uses it, well, then it's not generating any value.
Right.
So how do you come up with those other metrics to resemble usage and the generation of the value than the value specifically itself?
Yeah. So maybe to just paraphrase you, what you're really doing is you're saying everything is measurable in some way,
Yeah.
right? So as you mature as a leader, you're moving toward, right, even if it's not dollars, even if you have to say, it's like power and water, it's a foundational utility. We'll agree that if we don't have power, we can't run our business, but it's hard to value. Okay, metaphor.
Right.
But what you're doing as you mature as a leader and as this federated model matures is you're forcing everyone to assign some flavor of value. And what you're really playing for is the later, oh, well, let's remove it because you're preparing for that question of let's kill it event, am I right?
Yeah, exactly. No, and that's one thing I do with all my organizations is be able to have put together your value statement. It doesn't have to be this hard number. Sometimes some of these projects, absolutely, you can go 100% pure statistical test and learn and be able to measure that exact impact. That's great. If you can do that, do that all day long. You can't. The reality is we've got other business units and segments and projects that we deliver that have immense value, but you may not be able to quantify it directly. But having put together that scorecard to be able to say, hey, business, here's the value that we are delivering to the organization by having this model and executing this way is incredibly important for that sustainability of not only just standing it up, but continue to maintain and deliver value for the company.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, excellent, Keith. Jason, I'm going to hand it back over to you for close here, but Keith, just what we wanted today. I mean, it feels like we've spent a lot of time on mechanics and frameworks this quarter on the model, and you're giving the color commentary between the lines here on, this is not a free lunch. This is this is not necessarily, easy to do. It's a state you earn,
Yeah,
right, over time, I think, and you work toward.
absolutely.
Fair? Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks so much. Jason, over to you.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for the commentary and the questions in the chat. If we weren't able to get to your question, we'll do our best to address it after the session. So thank you all so much. And thank you, Keith, again, for bringing your insights and your experiences to the session. It was very informative. So please take 1 minute to give feedback on this session. The survey form should pop up on your screen. It really helps us to develop timely and relevant content for the community. Stay tuned on our email and social channels for tools and resources and other content to help you build a successful federated analytics operating model. And as everyone kind of dips into the survey here, a really good place to start is around federated analytics resources is going to our hub, which answers questions like, what does a healthy federated analytics model look like in practice? What are the most effective ways to transition to a federated model? What causes federated models to fail and how you can avoid it? We got a lot of really great resources there, a federated readiness assessment, high level that you can do, an exclusive roundtable peer insights, some good takeaways there, and as well as takeaways from real expert exchanges on federated analytics. Also, keep an eye out for content about measuring analytics ROI and communicating value, which we talked a bit about today. Over the next few weeks, ROI value will be our next sort of deep dive exploration, and we plan to have a webinar on this challenge in about a month or so. So keep your eyes out for that session. Until then, everybody, onward and upward. Thank you for joining and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you.